Whew, long day at work, huh? All right, let's log into Tarisland for a little bit and maybe find ourselves a little something to do, you know? Oh, all right. Just a quick little pop-up. Okay, let's get rid of that. Oh, okay, another pop-up. All right, 3 pop-ups, 4 pop-ups, 5 pop-ups, 5 pop-ups, 6. Hello everybody, today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the good, the bad, and everything in between of Tarisland, and we'll answer the question of whether you should play it or skip it. If you're interested in more MMO or Tarisland related content, check out my channel below. Okay, let's start on a positive note with the good. This game looks amazing. I mean, look at this. They haven't gone for any hyper-realism or anything, but instead they've gone for this amazing and charming art style that you could just look at for hours and hours and hours and pretty much not get tired of. It's especially impressive, I think, if you consider the fact that this is actually a cross-platform game. So to be able to look at views like this on a mobile phone is really, really cool. And they've done a really, really good job with the lighting. Whether it's the sun or it's the moon, all the lighting looks really, really good, and it creates this really nice atmosphere in the overworld and in dungeons and raids. Plus, you get to take photos like this one. I mean, look at that. That is a fantastic looking game. Besides the visuals though, a big part of any gaming experience is how it sounds. And another great thing about Tarisland is that it has an amazing soundtrack. A soundtrack that I honestly have been listening to outside of the game. I've just been listening to it in my free time. It just sounds really, really good. And that combined with the visuals that we just talked about is honestly half the battle of creating a world that your players want to live in. And I think they've done a really, really, really good job at that. Okay, listen to this little snippet of one of the soundtracks in the game here and try to tell me that it's not incredible. You won't. Yeah, it's that good. So, not that he needs this as a 3-time Emmy-winning composer, but shout out to Russell Brower and whoever decided to bring this incredibly talented composer onto this project, because he has absolutely smashed it out of the park and I have pretty much no critiques whatsoever. The next good thing about Tarisland is that it's actually got some pretty great boss design. Now obviously it doesn't really compare to the likes of Dark Souls or Elden Ring, but I don't really think it ever needs to. At the end of the day, this is a tab target MMO, and in that context, they've done a really good job of creating bosses that are pretty unique and very interesting to fight, relatively speaking. This game also manages to avoid a pretty common pitfall in MMO development, and instead of focusing entirely on those numerical stats and that number go up gameplay where you just collect equipment and then your attack and your defense just go up and up and up, they've actually done a really good job of creating dungeons and raids where learning the mechanics is actually an important part of getting better at doing them. So you can actually increase your efficiency, your DPS, your healing, all through experience and honing your skills. So there is that level of growth available to you in Tarisland that a lot of MMOs kind of tend to lack, which is undoubtedly a plus. The fourth great thing about Tarisland is actually something that I see very commonly in Eastern games in general, which is very intricate exploration systems where you're kind of going around the overworld collecting various things. Now, obviously, this isn't something that the Tarisland devs came up with themselves, but I think they've done a really good job of implementing it in a way that ties into the rest of the game really nicely. The rewards that you get from reaching certain tiers of exploration are nice, but not game-breaking, but instead they just kind of encourage that inner completionist in all of us to walk around, explore the world, and find these items. They've also got a variety of items here. This can be a little confusing because why, right? Why are there so many different things to collect? Why can't it just be the same thing? I don't know. But still, this is an optional task for players to do, and it is a very fun optional task for players to do. And I honestly wish that more MMOs do it, because who doesn't like the feeling of completing a chapter or completing a map in its entirety and exploring every single corner of the world that they're expected to be immersed in? It's a great idea, and I think they've done it really, really well. The final good thing that I kind of want to touch on is that when an MMO comes out of the East, there is this sort of fear and expectation of very large grinds. I mean, think of Black Desert Online, think of MapleStory, think of Lost Ark. These games are kind of defined by the amount of grind that you have to do later on, among other things, of course. But the good thing is that Tarisland doesn't seem to be following in those footsteps. The amount of time and energy that you need to spend grinding just to stay competitive is honestly not that high, compared even to some of the MMOs coming out of the West. The game's been out for almost a month now. If you wanted to jump in today and catch up so that you're relevant in your PvE dungeons and even in PvP today, it's not difficult. Just run the dungeons that you missed out on a few times and you'll be there in a couple of hours at most. It's really not a very difficult game to stay relevant in, which is a good thing. I think there's a big demand nowadays for MMOs that are not a massive time sink because nobody has that kind of time anymore, honestly. So I think Tarisland fits that bill really nicely. Okay, that's enough praise. Tarisland, like all MMOs, comes with its fair share of issues. So now, let's talk about the bad. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about how gorgeous this game is, and it really is. It looks amazing, but there is a small problem. The problem is that the world is just too small. Now, I get that this is a new MMO, it's just come out, and in the future, we're gonna get more releases, but in 2024, when the choices for MMOs are actually pretty vast, it doesn't really make sense to come out with a release that has such a small overworld. To make things worse, the map isn't very deep, and I mean literally deep. When you look at games like RuneScape, when you look at games like Black Desert Online, you've got multiple levels to the overworld. You've got your surface level, and then maybe multiple underground levels, and maybe even levels above the ground. In Tarisland, none of that exists. The only break to the overworld that you have are these dungeons, and those are very linear. So what ends up happening is that it feels quite cramped and small, which is not great. To make things even worse, Tarisland allows you to teleport almost anywhere in the map as long as you've been there at least once before. So I can just sit here in one corner of the map and just teleport to the other corner, and I've just missed out on the entire world that you've spent so much time and effort creating. As an MMO player, I'm supposed to be immersed in this world. I'm supposed to be a part of it. But I don't really get that feeling with Tarisland. Now, in its defense, a lot of MMOs do this, and I just never think it's a good idea because you've created a world that is actually really cool and interesting, and you've just given the players the ability to click a mouse button, which is the equivalent of snapping your fingers, and just find themselves on the other side having skipped all of it. Immersion breaking aside, because whatever, who cares about immersion, right? It's just silly to not have your player traverse the world that you've created, which is not great. The next bad thing about Tarisland is something that you typically mostly see in mobile games, so I guess it creeped its way into Tarisland since it's cross-platform, and it's the fact that there are way too many currencies. To the point, it's almost like the devs want you to handle and manage more currencies than the foreign exchange reserves of some countries. Don't believe me? Alright, let's go through them. Silver, gold, crystals, achromatic crystals, destiny tokens, rare metals, ancient metals, Ray medals, companion badges, friendship badges. So yeah, that's a lot of oh no, it's not done. Tier 1 colorful shards, Tier 2 colorful shards, and of course, who can forget Arcs of Destiny. Tarisland. That is way too many currencies. That's 15 different currencies, all of which are used to buy most of the same stuff. Why? Why would you ever need to split it up that way? Well, obviously we know why. It's so that every activity gives you a different currency so that you'd be kind of forced to do them all to stay competitive. It's sleazy, it's not nice, and it obviously plays on the fear of missing out and forces you to do activities even if you don't really care about them. Unfortunately though, it's also really effective, but that doesn't mean that we're not gonna call it out when we see it. Okay, so the next bad thing about Tarisland is another thing that a lot of MMOs, especially Eastern MMOs, find themselves doing. So when you're playing an MMO, there's that early leveling experience where you're playing through a story, you're exploring the world, and you're making your way to the second part, which is the end game. The problem with Tarisland is that you're going through that leveling process insanely fast. It's so fast that you can actually get to level 40, which is the cap, with reasonably good equipment to keep up with raids and dungeons in literally a few hours. Way way less than a day. It doesn't even take half a day to get there. And even worse than that is that once you hit that level cap and you have reasonably good equipment, you're never going back to those early dungeons ever again. Yes, there is something called an arcane realm, which is basically a harder version of those early dungeons, but realistically, you're never going back to those actual dungeons themselves. So when new players come in and they have to queue up for these dungeons for quests, and because they're leveling themselves, they're gonna find that nobody else is doing those dungeons. In fact, I've had this experience as well when creating additional characters. When I made my last character a few days ago, I couldn't find anybody to do those early dungeons. In fact, the game insisted that I had to do them with bots instead because there was just nobody doing them. Plus, this is just really bad game design. That early leveling process is where you feel the most growth of your character. So if you burn through that in a few hours and then suddenly you find yourself at endgame not growing nearly as fast and nearly as much, the whole game just feels really slow all of a sudden, and it feels like you've hit a wall. And this, I think, is just going to lead to a lot of people leaving Tarisland because they just feel like they've reached the end of the game and they're done with it. Now again, this is something that a lot of MMOs, especially Eastern MMOs, do, so it's not a Tarisland specific critique, but unfortunately Tarisland does it too, and that is a bad thing. The fourth bad thing that I want to touch upon is actually a technical one. We talked a little earlier about how good the graphics are, especially for a cross-platform game, but the servers don't quite get the same amount of love from the devs, it seems, because they are pretty bad. Now, the server that I connect to has servers for other games, and when I play those other games, I get 60 to 80 ping on those servers. But on Tarisland servers, which are in the same location, I'm getting 100 to 300 ping at all times. Now, as an MMO, this isn't terrible, and it's much better than if it were, for example, a competitive shooter like Valorant or CS, but in the case of Tarisland specifically, high ping has a very significant impact on your DPS and your healing per second. So the fact that these servers are as bad as they are from a company like Tencent, who makes Tarisland, is honestly unacceptable. It shouldn't be this bad. Tencent has other games with servers in the same place that the Tarisland servers are in, which work perfectly well. So there's clearly something going on with the netcode or how they've set up these servers that is causing such a big issue. Now, I can't say for certain that this is going to be the case for you. I'm in Asia, so the servers may be better in the US or the EU or wherever else you're playing, but I've confirmed that the issues with the servers in this part of the world are affecting a lot of players. Maybe in the future, the devs can work on that netcode a little bit more to make the connections more stable and better, or even just get better servers so that the ping is lower. Regardless, we can't really depend on an unknown future when we're talking about the game as it is right now, and as it is right now, the servers are really bad. Okay, so we've talked about the good and we've talked about the bad. So now let's talk a little bit about everything else. These are things that are concerning to me, but are not necessarily bad, and you may not always find them annoying, or they might not always bother you, depending on what kind of game that you're looking for and what you're looking for in your MMOs in general. So the first thing I want to address, and I think a lot of people expected this to be in the bad category for this game, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about it as well, and that is how pay to win Tarisland actually is. The truth is that it's honestly not that crazy. There's not a lot that you can get in terms of getting ahead in the game for real money. There is one thing though, and that's the ability to spend real money to get in-game gold. Now, you can't get it directly, of course. You can't just go to some sort of window and buy gold for real money, but instead you can buy things like battle passes. In fact, there's actually multiple battle passes in this game that give you many things, of which the most important, of course, is gold. Now, we talked about all the different currencies before, but gold is the one that actually really matters, because gold is what you use to buy things off the player marketplace. So the ability to convert real money to gold is actually a pretty scary thing, and it's completely okay to be put off by it. However, I would say that this doesn't actually have all that big of an impact on the game itself, because equipment is actually very easy to get. So the fact that you can just get gold and then buy that equipment off the marketplace doesn't really create that much of an imbalance between free-to-play players and whales. However, I'm putting this in the everything else category despite not thinking that the pay to win is that bad, because this could get worse. As the game evolves, as more content gets added, if the grind becomes quite large, then buying gold with real money and then buying that equipment from the marketplace could become a significantly faster way to gear up than just grinding it out. And I think the fact that you can get gold in the first place is already quite a big red flag. However, for now, it's not really all that bad. The second not so bad, not so good thing that I want to touch upon is the amount of pop-ups that you get when you log into the game. Now, getting a pop-up, getting 2 pop-ups, that's okay. But getting 5, 6, 7 pop-ups when you log into a game is honestly the most off-putting thing that I've ever encountered in any MMO I've ever played. The fact of the matter is, with advertising running so rampant across all of the internet, the last thing that a player wants to do is come home, maybe from work, maybe from school, sit down in front of their computer, load up a game to relax, and then be giga advertised to by pop-up after pop-up after pop-up. Now, I personally think that this is a very bad thing, but I put it in this category of everything else. But the fact of the matter is, this might not actually bother you if you typically play Eastern games like gachas or other Eastern MMOs, because this is a very common thing in those kinds of games. So I can see a world and I can imagine a player that isn't really bothered by this at all. But if you're like me, this is definitely gonna bother you. The final thing I want to touch upon is that the story for this game is kind of not great. Now, I'm not expecting writing at the levels of Tolkien or Dostoevsky, but at the same time, I do wish the game had a much more interesting storyline. As it is, it's very, very, very generic, and it's the same, oh, bad things are happening, let's figure out what's causing the bad things storyline that we've seen and played through a million times in a million other MMOs. I've put this in the everything else category for 2 reasons. The first is, maybe it'll get better. As more content comes out, as more of the story develops, maybe we'll see the story take a pretty interesting turn. The other reason is that a lot of players don't actually care about the story at all. So if you're a player who just wants to play an MMO for the community, to collect gear, or for anything else like that, then the fact that the story sucks isn't going to change anything for you at all. That said though, it is hard to ignore just how boring it is, because it is really barely anything at all. I mean, I don't want to be too harsh, but it kind of is like it's written by a high schooler. It's got no depth, the characters have no development. At no point did I even care about any of these people in that story. I wish it were better, but unfortunately right now, as it is, it's really not. So that was all the good, the bad, and everything in between for Tarisland. So the question now that we have is, should you play this game or should you skip it? Well, the answer is yes, but maybe not forever. The reality is, we expect a little too much of our MMOs and we hold them to a weirdly higher standard than any other game. Where getting 20 hours of gameplay out of a single player game that you bought is good value, getting the same playtime out of a free-to-play MMO feels like a scam. But it shouldn't really feel that way, right? Well, I think Tarisland is a good example of this. Will you be playing in months from now if you started today? Probably not. Does it have obvious flaws and bad choices that will lead to a ton of players leaving? Yeah, it does have a few of those. But will you have a really good time for good 10 to 20 hours? Well, yeah, I actually do think so. And I think that's okay. I think that's enough. Of course, there are some MMOs that I wouldn't even bother trying, even if they are free. But despite its many issues, Tarisland is genuinely a fun little MMO that I can actually definitely recommend you try out, even if you know you won't be in its world for very long. So Tarisland, with all of its little quirks, gets my seal of approval. So those are my thoughts on Tarisland and whether you should play it. But what do you guys think? Are you already playing Tarisland? If you are, what do you think about it? And if you're not, will you be giving it a go? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Make sure to check out my channel below and I'll see you guys next time.